Chapter 11 of The Coral Island. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Coral Island by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 11. Effects of Overeating and Reflections thereon. Humble Advice regarding Cold Water. The Horrible Cry accounted for. The Curious Birds called Penguins. Peculiarity of the coconut palm. Questions on the formation of coral islands. Mysterious footsteps. Strange discoveries and sad sights. When we awoke on the following morning, we found that the sun was already a good way above the horizon, so I came to the conclusion that a heavy supper is not conducive to early rising. Nevertheless, we felt remarkably strong and well, and much disposed to have our breakfast. First, however, we had our customary morning bath, which refreshed us greatly. I have often wondered very much in after years that the inhabitants of my own dear land did not make more frequent use of this most charming element, water, I mean in the way of cold bathing. Of course I have perceived that it is not convenient for them to go into the sea or the rivers in winter, as we used to do on the Coral Island, but then I knew from experience that a large washing tub and a sponge do form a most pleasant substitute. The feelings of freshness, of cleanliness, of vigor, and extreme hilarity that always followed my baths in the sea, and even, when in England, my ablutions in the wash-tub, were so delightful that I would sooner have gone without my breakfast than without my bath in cold water. My readers will forgive me for asking whether they are in the habit of bathing thus every morning, and if they answer no, they will pardon me for recommending them to begin at once. Of late years, since retiring from the stirring life of adventure which I have led so long in foreign climes, I have heard of a system called the cold water cure. Now, I do not know much about that system, so I do not mean to uphold it, neither do I intend to run it down. Perhaps in reference to it, I may just hint that there may be too much of a good thing, I know not. But of this I am quite certain, that there may also be too little of a good thing. And the great delight that I have had in cold bathing during the course of my adventurous career inclines me to think that it is better to risk taking too much than to content oneself with too little. Such is my opinion, derived from much experience, but I put it before my readers with the utmost diffidence and with profound modesty, knowing that it may possibly jar with their feelings of confidence in their own ability to know and judge as to what is best and fittest in reference to their own affairs. But to return from this digression, for which I humbly crave forgiveness, we had not advanced on our journey much above a mile or so, and were just beginning to feel the pleasant glow that usually accompanies vigorous exercise, when, on turning a point that revealed to us a new and beautiful cluster of islands, we were suddenly arrested by the appalling cry which had so alarmed us a few nights before. But this time we were by no means so much alarmed as on the previous occasion, because, whereas at that time it was night, now it was day, and I have always found, though I am unable to account for it, that daylight banishes many of the fears that are apt to assail us in the dark. On hearing the sound, Peterkin instantly threw forward his spear. "Now, what can it be?" said he, looking round at Jack. "I tell you what it is, if we are to go on being pulled up in a constant state of horror and astonishment, as we have been for the last week, the sooner we're out of this island the better, notwithstanding the yams and lemonade and port and plums." Peterkin's mark was followed by a repetition of the cry, louder than before. "It comes from one of these islands," said Jack. "It must be the point of a jackass, then," said Peterkin, "for I never heard anything so like." We all turned our eyes towards the cluster of islands, where, on the largest, we observed curious objects moving on the shore. "Soldiers they are, that's flat!" cried Peterkin, gazing at them in the utmost amazement. And in truth Peterkin's remark seemed to me to be correct, for at the distance from which we saw them they appeared to be an army of soldiers. There they stood, rank and file, in lines and in squares, marching and countermarching, with blue coats and white trousers. While we were looking at them the dreadful cry came again over the water, and Peterkin suggested it must be a regiment sent out to massacre the natives in cold blood. At this remark Jack laughed and said, "Why, Peterkin, they are penguins!" "Penguins?" repeated Peterkin. "Ay, penguins, Peterkin, penguins! Nothing more or less than big sea birds, as you shall see one of these days when we pay them a visit in our boat, which I mean to set about building the moment we return to our bower." "So then our dreadful yelling ghosts and our murdering army of soldiers," remarked Peterkin, "have dwindled down to penguins, big sea birds? Very good. Then I propose that we continue our journey as fast as possible, lest our island should be converted into a dream before we get completely round it." Now, as we continued our way, I pondered much over this new discovery and the singular appearance of these birds, of which Jack could only give us a very slight and vague account, and I began to long to commence our boat, in order that we might go and inspect them more narrowly. But by degrees these thoughts left me, and I began to be much taken up again with the interesting peculiarities of the country which we were passing through. The second night we passed in a manner somewhat similar to the first, at about 2/3 of the way round the island as we calculated, and we hoped to sleep on the night following at our bower. I will not here note so particularly all that we said and saw during the course of the second day, as we did not make any further discoveries of great importance. The shore along which we travelled, and the various parts of the woods through which we passed, were similar to those which have been already treated of. There were one or two observations that we made, however, and these were as follows. We saw that, while many of the large fruit-bearing trees grew only in the valleys, and some of them only near the banks of the streams, where the soil was peculiarly rich, the coconut nut palm grew in every place whatsoever, not only on the hillsides, but also on the seashore, and even, as has already been stated, on the coral reef itself, where the soil, if we may use the name, was nothing better than loose sand mingled with broken shells and coral rock. So near to the sea, too, did this useful tree grow, that in many places its roots were washed away by the spray from the breakers. Yet we found the trees growing thus on the sands to be quite as luxuriant as those growing in the valleys, and the fruit as good and refreshing also. Besides this, I noticed that on the summit of the high mountain, which we once more ascended at a different point from our first ascent, were found abundance of shells and broken coral formations, which, Jack and I agreed, proved either that this island must have once been under the sea, or that the sea must once have been above the island. In other words, that as shells and coral could not possibly climb to the mountain top, they must have been washed upon it while the mountain top was on a level with the sea. We pondered this very much, and we put to ourselves the question, what raised the island to its present height above the sea? But to this we could by no means give to ourselves a satisfactory reply. Jack thought it might have been blown up by a volcano, and Peterkin said he thought it must have jumped up of its own accord. We also noticed, what had escaped us before, that the solid rocks of which the island was formed were quite different from the live coral rocks on the shore, where the wonderful little insects were continually working. They seemed, indeed, to be of the same material, a substance like limestone, but while the coral rocks were quite full of minute cells in which the insects lived, the other rocks inland were hard and solid, without the appearance of cells at all. Our thoughts and conversations on this subject were sometimes so profound that Peterkin said we should certainly get drowned in them at last, even although we were such good divers. Nevertheless, we did not allow his pleasantry on this and similar points to deter us from making our notes and observations as we went along. We found several more droves of hogs in the woods, but abstained from killing any of them, having more than sufficient for our present necessities. We saw also many of their footprints in this neighborhood. Among these we also observed the footprints of a smaller animal, which we examined with much care, but could form no certain opinion as to them. Peterkin thought they were those of a little dog, but Jack and I thought differently. We became very curious on this matter, the more so that we observed these footprints to lie scattered about in one locality, as if the animal which had made them was wandering round about in a very irregular manner, and without any object in view. Early in the forenoon of our third day we observed these footprints to be much more numerous than ever, and in one particular spot they diverged off into the woods in a regular beaten track, which was, however, so closely beset with bushes that we pushed through it with difficulty. We had now become so anxious to find out what animal this was and where it went to, that we determined to follow the track and, if possible, clear up the mystery. Peterkin said, in a bantering tone, that he was sure it would be cleared up, as usual, in some frightfully simple way, and proved to be no mystery at all. The beaten track seemed much too large to have been formed by the animal itself, and we concluded that some larger animal had made it, and that the smaller one made use of it. But everywhere the creeping plants and tangled bushes crossed our path, so that we forced our way along with some difficulty. Suddenly, as we came upon an open space, we heard a faint cry, and observed a black animal standing in the track before us. "A wild cat!" cried Jack, fitting an arrow to his bow, and discharging it so hastily that he missed the animal and hit the earth about half a foot to one side of it. To our surprise, the wild cat did not fly, but walked slowly towards the arrow and snuffed at it. "That's the most comical wild cat I ever saw!" cried Jack. "It's a tame wild cat, I think," said Peterkin, levelling his spear to make a charge. "Stop!" cried I, laying my hand on his shoulder. "I do believe the poor beast is blind. See, it strikes against the branches as it walks along. It must be a very old one," and I hastened toward it. "Only think," said Peterkin with a suppressed laugh, "of a superannuated wild cat!" We now found that the poor cat was not only blind, or nearly so, but extremely deaf, as it did not hear our footsteps until we were quite close behind it. Then it sprang round, and putting up its back and tail, while the black hair stood all on end, ordered a hoarse mew and a fuff. "Poor thing!" said Peterkin, gently extending his hand and endeavouring to pat the cat's head. "Poor pussy! Chee chee chee! Puss puss puss! Cheetie pussy!" No sooner did the cat hear these sounds than all signs of anger fled, and advancing eagerly to Peterkin, it allowed itself to be stroked, and rubbed itself against his legs, purring loudly all the time, and showing every symptom of the most extreme delight. "It's no more a wild cat than I am!" cried Peterkin, taking it in his arms. "It's quite tame! Poor pussy, cheetie pussy!" We now crowded around Peterkin, and were not a little surprised, and, to say truth, a good deal affected, by the sight of the poor animal's excessive joy. It rubbed its head against Peterkin's cheek, licked his chin, and thrust its head almost violently into his neck, while it purred more loudly than I ever heard a cat purr before, and appeared to be so much overpowered by its feelings that it occasionally mewed and purred almost in the same breath. Such demonstrations of joy and affection led us at once to conclude that this poor cat must have known man before, and we conjectured that it had been left either accidentally or by design on the island many years ago, and was now evincing its extreme joy at meeting once more with human beings. While we were fondling the cat and talking about it, Jack glanced round the open space in the midst of which we stood. "Hello!" exclaimed he. "This looks something like a clearing. The axe has been at work here. Just look at these tree stumps!" We now turned to examine these, and without doubt we found trees that had been cut down here and there, also stumps and broken branches, all of which, however, were completely covered with moss, and bore evidence of having been in this condition for some years. No human footprints were to be seen, either on the track or among the bushes, but those of the cat were found everywhere. We now determined to follow up the track as far as it went, and Peterkin put the cat down, but it seemed to be so weak and mewed so very pitifully that he took it up again and carried it in his arms, where in a few minutes it fell sound asleep. About 10 yards farther on, the felled trees became more numerous, and the track, diverging to the right, followed for a short space the banks of a stream. Suddenly we came to a spot where once must have been a rude bridge, the stones of which were scattered in the stream, and those on each bank entirely covered over with moss. In silent surprise and expectancy we continued to advance, and a few yards farther on beheld, under the shelter of some breadfruit trees, a small hut or cottage. I cannot hope to convey to my readers a very correct idea of the feelings that affected us on witnessing this unexpected sight. We stood for a long time in silent wonder, for there was a deep and most melancholy stillness about the place that quite overpowered us, and when we did at length speak, it was in subdued whispers, as if we were surrounded by some awful or supernatural influence. Even Peterkin's voice, usually so quick and lively on all occasions, was hushed now, for there was a dreariness about this silent, lonely, uninhabited cottage, so strange in its appearance, so far away from the usual dwellings of man, so old, decayed, and deserted in its aspect, that fell upon our spirits like a thick cloud, and blotted out, as with a pall, the cheerful sunshine that had filled us since the commencement of our tour round the island. The hut or cottage was rude and simple in its construction. It was not more than 12 feet long by 10 feet broad, and about 7 or 8 feet high. It had one window, or rather a small frame in which a window might perhaps once have been, but which was now empty. The door was exceedingly low, and formed of rough boards, and the roof was covered with broad cocoa-nut and plantain leaves. But every part of it was in a state of the utmost decay. Moss and green matter grew in spots all over it. The woodwork was quite perforated with holes, the roof had nearly fallen in, and appeared to be prevented from doing so altogether by the thick matting of creeping plants and the interlaced branches which years of neglect had allowed to cover it almost entirely, while the thick luxuriant branches of the breadfruit and other trees spread above it, and flung a deep sombre shadow over the spot, as if to guard it from the heat and the light of day. We conversed long and in whispers about this strange habitation ere we ventured to approach it, and when at length we did so, it was, at least on my part, with feelings of awe. At first Jack endeavoured to peep in at the window, but from the deep shadow of the trees already mentioned and the gloom within, he could not clearly discern objects, so we lifted the latch and pushed open the door. We observed that the latch was made of iron, and almost eaten away with rust. In the like condition were also the hinges, which creaked as the door swung back. On entering, we stood still and gazed around us, while we were much impressed with the dreary stillness of the room. But what we saw there surprised and shocked us not a little. There was no furniture in the apartment save a little wooden stool and an iron pot, the latter almost eaten through with rust. In the corner farthest from the door was a low bedstead, on which lay two skeletons, embedded in a little heap of dry dust. With beating hearts we went forward to examine them. One was the skeleton of a man, the other that of a dog, which was extended close beside that of the man, with its head resting on his bosom. Now we were very much concerned about this discovery, and could scarce refrain from tears on beholding these sad remains. After some time we began to talk about what we had seen, and to examine in and around the hut, in order to discover some clue to the name or history of this poor man who had thus died in solitude, with none to mourn his loss save his cat and his faithful dog. But we found nothing, neither a book nor a scrap of paper. We found, however, the decayed remains of what appeared to have been clothing and an old axe. But none of these things bore marks of any kind, and indeed they were so much decayed as to convince us that they had lain in the condition in which we found them for many years. This discovery now accounted to us for the tree stump at the top of the mountain with the initials cut on it, also for the patch of sugar cane and other traces of man which we had met with in the course of our rambles over the island. And we were much saddened by the reflection that the lot of this poor wanderer might possibly be our own after many years' residence on the island, unless we should be rescued by the visit of some vessel or the arrival of natives. Having no clue whatever to account for the presence of this poor human being in such a lonely spot, we fell to conjecturing what could have brought him there. I was inclined to think that he must have been a shipwrecked sailor, whose vessel had been lost here, and all the crew drowned except himself and his dog and cat. But Jack thought it more likely that he had run away from his vessel, and had taken the dog and cat to keep him company. We were also much occupied in our minds with the wonderful difference between the cat and the dog. For here we saw that while the one perished like a loving friend by its master's side, with its head resting on his bosom, the other had sought to sustain itself by prowling abroad in the forest, and had lived in solitude to a good old age. However, we did not conclude from this that the cat was destitute of affection, for we could not forget its emotions on first meeting with us, but we saw from this that the dog had a great deal more of generous love in its nature than the cat, because it not only found it impossible to live after the death of its master, but it must needs, when it came to die, crawl to his side and rest its head upon his lifeless breast. While we were thinking on these things, and examining into everything about the room, we were attracted by an exclamation from Peterkin. "I say, Jack," said he, "here is something that will be of use to us." "What is it?" said Jack, hastening across the room. "An old pistol," replied Peterkin, holding up the weapon, which he had just pulled from under a heap of broken wood and rubbish that lay in a corner. "That indeed might have been useful," said Jack, examining it, "if we had any powder; but I suspect the bow and the sling will prove more serviceable." "True, I forgot about that," said Peterkin; "but we may as well take it with us, for the flint will serve to strike fire with when the sun does not shine." After having spent more than an hour at this place, without discovering anything of further interest, Peterkin took up the old cat, which had lain very contentedly asleep on the stool whereon he had placed it, and we prepared to take our departure. In leaving the hut, Jack stumbled heavily against the door-post, which was so much decayed as to break across, and the whole fabric of the hut seemed ready to tumble about our ears. This put it into our heads that we might as well pull it down, and so form a mound over the skeleton. Jack, therefore, with his axe, cut down the other door-post, which, when it was done, brought the whole hut in ruins to the ground, and thus formed a grave to the bones of the poor recluse and his dog. Then we left the spot, having brought away the iron pot, the pistol, and the old axe, as they might be of much use to us hereafter. During the rest of this day we pursued our journey, and examined the other end of the large valley, which we found to be so much alike to the parts already described that I shall not recount the particulars of what we saw in this place. I may, however, remark that we did not quite recover our former cheerful spirits until we arrived at our bower, which we did late in the evening, and found everything just in the same condition as we had left it 3 days before. End of chapter 11. Recording by Tom Weiss. Of the Coral Island. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Coral Island by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 12. Something Wrong with the Tank. Jack's Wisdom and Peterkin's Impertinence. Wonderful Behavior of a Crab. Good Wishes for Those Who Dwell Far from the Sea. Jack commences to build a little boat. Rest is sweet, as well for the body as for the mind. During my long experience amid the vicissitudes of a checkered life, I have found that periods of profound rest at certain intervals, in addition to the ordinary hours of repose, are necessary to the well-being of man. And the nature as well as the period of this rest varies according to different temperaments of individuals and the peculiar circumstances in which they may chance to be placed. To those who work with their minds, bodily labor is rest. To those who labor with the body, deep sleep is rest. To the downcast, the weary, and the sorrowful, joy and peace are rest. Nay, further, I think that to the gay, the frivolous, the reckless, when sated with pleasures that cannot last, even sorrow proves to be rest of a kind, although perchance it were better that I should call it relief than rest. There is, indeed, but one class of men to whom rest is denied. There is no rest to the wicked. At this I do but hint, however, as I treat not of that rest which is spiritual, but more particularly of that which applies to the mind and to the body. Of this rest we stood much in need of on our return home, and we found it exceedingly sweet when we indulged in it after completing the journey just related. It had not, indeed, been a very long journey. Nevertheless, we had pursued it so diligently that our frames were not a little prostrated. Our minds were also very much exhausted in consequence of the many surprises, frequent alarms, and much profound thought to which they had been subjected, so that when we lay down, on the night of our return, under the shelter of the bower, we fell immediately into very deep repose. I can state this with much certainty, for Jack afterwards admitted the fact, and Peterkin, although he stoutly denied it, I heard snoring loudly at least 2 minutes after lying down. In this condition we remained all night, and the whole of the following day without awaking once, or so much as moving our positions. When we did awake, it was near sunset, and we were all in such a state of lassitude that we merely rose to swallow a mouthful of food. As Peterkin remarked, in the midst of a yawn, we took breakfast at tea time, and then went to bed again, where we lay till the following forenoon. After this we arose very greatly refreshed, but much alarmed lest we had lost count of a day. I say we were much alarmed on this head, for we had carefully kept count of the days since we were cast upon our island, in order that we might remember the Sabbath day, which day we had hitherto, with one accord, kept as a day of rest and refrained from all work whatsoever. However, on considering the subject, we all three entertained the same opinion as to how long we had slept, and so our minds were put at ease. We now hastened to our water garden to enjoy a bath, and to see how did the animals which I had placed in the tank. We found the garden more charming, pellucid, and inviting than ever, and Jack and I plunged into its depths and gamboled among its radiant coral groves, while Peterkin wallowed at the surface and tried occasionally to kick us as we passed below. Having dressed, I then hastened to the tank, but what was my surprise and grief to find nearly all the animals dead, and the water in a putrid condition! I was greatly distressed at this, and wondered what could be the cause of it. "Why, you precious humbug!" said Peterkin, coming up to me. "How could you expect it to be otherwise? When fishes are accustomed to live in the Pacific Ocean, how can you expect them to exist in a hole like that?" "Indeed, Peterkin," I replied, "there seems to be truth in what you say. Nevertheless, now I think of it, there must be some error in your reasoning; for if I put in but a few very small animals, they will bear the same proportion to this pond that the millions of fish bear to the ocean." "I say, Jack!" cried Peterkin, waving his hand, "come here like a good fellow. Ralph is actually talking philosophy. Do come to our assistance, for he's out o' sight beyond me already." "What's the matter?" inquired Jack, coming up, while he endeavoured to scrub his long hair dry with a towel of cocoa nut cloth. I repeated my thoughts to Jack, who, I was happy to find, quite agreed with me. "The best plan," he said, "will be to put very few animals at first into your tank, and add more as you find it will bear them. And look here," he added, pointing to the sides of the tank, which, for the space of 2 inches above the water level, were encrusted with salt. "You must carry your philosophy a little further, Ralph. That water has evaporated so much that it is too salt for anything to live in. You will require to add fresh water now and then, in order to keep it at the same degree of saltness as the sea." "Very true, Jack. That never struck me before," said I. "And now I think of it," continued Jack, "it seems to me that the surest way of arranging your tank so as to get it to keep pure and in good condition will be to imitate the ocean in it; in fact, make it a miniature Pacific. I don't see how you can hope to succeed unless you do that." "Most true," said I, pondering what my companion said; "but I fear that will be very difficult." "Not at all!" cried Jack, rolling his towel up into a ball and throwing it into the face of Peterkin, who had been grinning and winking at him during the last 5 minutes. "Not at all. Look here. There is water of a certain saltness in the sea. Well, fill your tank with sea water, and keep it at that saltness by marking the height at which the water stands on the sides. When it evaporates a little, pour in fresh water from the brook till it comes up to the mark, and then it will be right; for the salt does not evaporate with the water. Then there's lots of seaweed in the sea. Well, go and get 1 or 2 bits of seaweed and put them into your tank. Of course the weed must be alive and growing to little stones, or you can chip a bit off the rocks with the weed sticking to it. Then, if you like, you can throw a little sand and gravel into your tank, and the thing's complete." "Nay, not quite," said Peterkin, who had been gravely attentive to this off-hand advice. "Not quite. You must first make 3 little men to dive in it before it can be said to be perfect, and that would be rather difficult, I fear, for 2 of them would require to be philosophers. But hallo! What's this? I say, Ralph, look here! There's one of your crabs up to something uncommon. It's performing the most remarkable operation for a crab I ever saw taking off its coat, I do believe, before going to bed." We hastily stooped over the tank, and certainly were not a little amused at the conduct of one of the crabs, which still survived its companions. It was one of the common small crabs, like to those that are found running about everywhere on the coast of England. While we gazed at it, we observed its back to split away from the lower part of its body, and out of the gap thus formed came a soft lump which moved and writhed unceasingly. This lump continued to increase in size until it appeared like a bunch of crabs' legs, and, indeed, Such it proved in a very few minutes to be, for the points of the toes were at length extricated from the hole in its back, the legs spread out, the body followed, and the crab walked away quite entire, even to the points of its nipper claws, leaving a perfectly entire shell behind it, so that when we looked, it seemed as though there were two complete crabs instead of one. "Well!" exclaimed Peterkin, drawing a long breath, "I've heard of a man jumping out of his skin and sitting down in his skeleton in order to cool himself, but I never expected to see a crab do it." We were, in truth, much amazed at this spectacle, when we observed that the new crab was larger than the crab that it came out of. It was also quite soft, but by next morning its skin had hardened into a good shell. We came thus to know that crabs grow in this way, and not by the growing of their shells, as we had always thought before we saw this wonderful operation. Now I considered well the advice when Jack had given me about preparing my tank, and the more I thought of it, the more I came to regard it as very sound and worthy of being acted on. So I forthwith put his plan in execution, and found it to answer excellently well, indeed much beyond my expectation, for I found that after a little experience had taught me the proper proportion of seaweed and animals to put into a certain amount of water, the tank needed no further attendance; and moreover, I did not require ever afterwards to renew or change the sea water, but only to add a very little fresh water from the brook now and then as the other evaporated. I therefore concluded that if I had been suddenly conveyed, along with my tank, into some region where there was no salt sea at all, my little sea and my sea fish would have continued to thrive and to prosper notwithstanding. This made me greatly to desire that those people in the world who live far inland might know of my wonderful tank, and by having materials like to those of which it was made conveyed to them, thus be enabled to watch the habits of those most mysterious animals that reside in the sea, and examine with their own eyes the wonders of the great deep. For many days after this, while Peterkin and Jack were busily employed in building a little boat out of the curious natural planks of the chestnut tree, I spent much of my time in examining with the burning glass the marvellous operations that were constantly going on in my tank. Here I saw those anemones which cling, like little red, yellow, and green blobs of jelly, to the rocks, put forth, as it were, a multitude of arms, and wait till little fish or other small animalcules unwarily touched them, when they would instantly seize them, fold arm after arm round their victims, and so engulf them in their stomachs. Here I saw the ceaseless working of those little coral insects, whose efforts have encrusted the islands of the Pacific with vast rocks, and surrounded them with enormous reefs; and I observed that many of these insects, though extremely minute, were very beautiful, coming out of their holes in a circle of fine threads, and having the form of a shuttlecock. Here I saw curious little barnacles opening a hole in their backs, and constantly putting out a thin, feathery hand, with which I doubt not they dragged their food into their mouths. Here also I saw those crabs which have shells only on the front of their bodies, but no shell whatever on their remarkably tender tails, so that in order to find a protection to them, they thrust them into the empty shells of whelks, or some such fish, and when they grow too big for one, change into another. But most curious of all, I saw an animal which had the wonderful power, when it became ill, of casting its stomach and its teeth away from it, and getting an entirely new set in the course of a few months. All this I saw, and a great deal more, by means of my tank and my burning glass; but I refrain from setting down more particulars here, as I have still much to tell of the adventures that befell us while we remained on this island. Chapter 12. Recording by Tom Weiss. Of the Coral Island. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Coral Island by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 13. Notable discovery at the Spouting cliffs. The mysterious green monster explained. We are thrown into unutterable terror by the idea that Jack is drowned. The Diamond Cave. "Come, Jack," cried Peterkin one morning about 3 weeks after our return from our long excursion. "Let's be jolly today, and do something vigorous. I'm quite tired of hammering and bammering, hewing and screwing, cutting and butting at that little boat of ours, that seems as hard to build as Noah's Ark. Let us go on an excursion to the mountain top, or have a hunt after the wild ducks, or make a dash at the pigs. I'm quite flat as bad ginger beer, flat as a pancake. In fact, I want something to rouse me, to toss me up, as it were. Eh? What do you say to it?" "Well," answered Jack, throwing down the axe with which he was just about to proceed towards the boat, "if that's what you want, I would recommend you to make an excursion to the waterspouts. The last one we had to do with tossed you up a considerable height. Perhaps the next will send you higher, who knows, if you're at all reasonable or moderate in your expectations." "Jack, my dear boy," said Peterkin gravely, "you are really becoming too fond of jesting. It's a thing I don't at all approve of, and if you don't give it up I fear that, for our mutual good, we shall have to part." "Well then, Peterkin," replied Jack with a smile, "what would you have?" "Have?" said Peterkin. "I would have nothing. I didn't say I wanted to have, I said I wanted to do." "By the by," said I, interrupting their conversation, "I am reminded by this that we have not yet discovered the nature of yon curious appearance that we saw near the waterspouts on our journey round the island. Perhaps it would be well to go for that purpose." "Humph!" ejaculated Peterkin. "I know the nature of it well enough." "What was it?" said I. "It was of a mysterious nature, to be sure," said he with a wave of his hand, while he rose from the log on which he had been sitting and buckled on his belt, into which he thrust his enormous club. "Well, then, let us away to the waterspouts," cried Jack, going up to the bower for his bow and arrows. "And bring your spear, Peterkin; it may be useful." We now, having made up our minds to examine into this matter, sallied forth eagerly in the direction of the waterspout rocks, which, as I have before mentioned, were not far from our present place of abode. On arriving there, we hastened down to the edge of the rocks, and gazed over into the sea, where we observed the pale green object, still distinctly visible, moving its tail slowly to and fro in the water. "Most remarkable," said Jack. "Exceedingly curious," said I. "Beats everything," said Peterkin. "Now, Jack," he added, "you made such a poor figure in your last attempt to stick that object that I would advise you to let me try it. If it has got a heart at all, I'll engage to send my spear right through the core of it. If it hasn't got a heart, I'll send it through the spot where its heart ought to be." "Fire away, then, my boy," replied Jack with a laugh. Peterkin immediately took the spear, poised it for a second or two above his head, then darted it like an arrow into the sea. Down it went, straight into the centre of the green object, passed quite through it, and came up immediately afterwards pure and unsullied, while the mysterious tail moved quietly as before. "Now," said Peterkin gravely, "that brute is a heartless monster. I'll have nothing more to do with it." "I'm pretty sure now," said Jack, "that it is merely a phosphoric light, but I must say I'm puzzled at its staying always in the same spot." I also was much puzzled, and inclined to think with Jack that it must be phosphoric light, of which luminous appearance we had seen much while on our voyage to these seas. "But," said I, "there is nothing to hinder us from diving down to it, now that we are sure it is not a shark." "True," returned Jack, stripping off his clothes. "I'll go down, Ralph, as I'm better at diving than you are. Now then, Peterkin, out of the road." Jack stepped forward, joined his hands above his head, bent over the rocks, and plunged into the sea. For a second or two the spray caused by his dive hid him from view. Then the water became still, and we saw him swimming far down in the midst of the green object. Suddenly he sank below it and vanished altogether from our sight. We gazed anxiously at the spot where he had disappeared for nearly a minute, expecting every moment to see him rise again for breath. But fully a minute passed, and still he did not reappear. 2 minutes passed, and then a flood of alarm rushed in upon my soul when I considered that, during all my acquaintance with him, Jack had never stayed under water for more than a minute at a time, indeed, seldom so long. "Oh, Peterkin," I said in a voice that trembled with increasing anxiety, "something has happened. It is more than 3 minutes now." But Peterkin did not answer, and I observed that he was gazing down into the water with a look of intense fear mingled with anxiety, while his face was overspread with a deadly paleness. Suddenly he sprang to his feet and rushed about in a frantic state, wringing his hands and exclaiming, "Oh, Jack! Jack! He is gone! It must have been a shark, and he is gone forever!" For the next 5 minutes I know not what I did. The intensity of my feelings almost bereft me of my senses. But I was recalled to myself by Peterkin seizing me by the shoulders and staring wildly into my face while he exclaimed, "Ralph! Ralph! Perhaps he has only fainted! Dive for him, Ralph!" It seems strange that this did not occur to me sooner. In a moment I rushed to the edge of the rocks, and without waiting to throw off my garments, was on the point to spring into the waves when I observed something black rising up through the green object. In another moment Jack's head rose to the surface, and he gave a wild shout, flinging back the spray from his locks, as was his wont after a dive. Now we were almost as much amazed at seeing him reappear, well and strong, as we had been at first at his non-appearance, for to the best of our judgment he had been nearly 10 minutes under water, perhaps longer, and it required no exertion of our reason to convince us that this was utterly impossible for mortal man to do and retain his strength and faculties. It was, therefore, with a feeling akin to superstitious awe that I held down my hand and assisted him to clamber up the steep rocks. But no such feeling affected Peterkin. No sooner did Jack gain the rocks and seat himself on one, panting for breath, than he threw his arms round his neck and burst into a flood of tears. "Oh, Jack, Jack!" said he. "Where were you? What kept you so long?" After a few moments, Peterkin became composed enough to sit still and listen to Jack's explanation, although he could not restrain himself from attempting to wink every 2 minutes at me in order to express his joy at Jack's safety. I say he attempted to wink, but I am bound to add that he did not succeed, for his eyes were so much swollen with weeping that his frequent attempts only resulted in a series of violent and altogether idiotical contortions of the face that were very far from expressing what he intended. However, I knew what the poor fellow meant by it, so I smiled to him in return, and endeavoured to make him believe that he was winking. "Now, lads," said Jack when we were composed enough to listen to him, "yon green object is not a shark. It is a stream of light issuing from a cave in the rocks. Just after I made my dive, I observed that this light came from the side of the rock above which we are now sitting, so I struck out for it, and saw an opening into some place or other that appeared to be luminous within. For one instant I paused to think about whether I ought to venture. Then I made up my mind and dashed into it. For you see, Peterkin, although I take some time to tell this, it happened in the space of a few seconds, so that I knew I had wind enough in me to serve to bring me out of the hole and up to the surface again. Well, I was just on the point of turning, for I began to feel a little uncomfortable in such a place, when it seemed to me as if there was a faint light right above me. I darted upwards and found my head out of water. This relieved me greatly, for I now felt that I could take in air enough to enable me to return the way I came. Then it all at once occurred to me that I might not be able to find the way out again, but on glancing downwards my mind was put quite at rest by seeing the green light below me streaming into the cave, just like the light that we had seen streaming out of it, only what I saw now was much brighter. At first I could scarcely see anything as I gazed around me, it was so dark, but gradually my eyes became accustomed to it, and I found that I was in a huge cave, part of the walls of which I observed on each side of me. The ceiling just above me was also visible, and I fancied that I could perceive beautiful glittering objects there, but the farther end of the cave was shrouded in darkness. While I was looking around me in great wonder, it came into my head that you two would think I was drowned. So I plunged down through the passage again in a great hurry, rose to the surface, and here I am." When Jack concluded his recital of what he had seen in this remarkable cave, I could not rest satisfied till I had dived down to see it, which I did, but found it so dark, as Jack had said, that I could scarcely see anything. When I returned we had a long conversation about it, during which I observed that Peterkin had a most lugubrious expression on his countenance. "What's the matter, Peterkin?" said I. "The matter?" he replied. "It's all very well for you two to be talking away like mermaids about the wonders of this cave, but you know I must be content to hear about it, while you are enjoying yourselves down there like mad dolphins. It's really too bad." "I'm very sorry for you, Peterkin, indeed I am," said Jack, "but we cannot help you. If you would only learn to dive—" "Learn to fly, you might as well say," retorted Peterkin in a very sulky tone. "If you would only consent to keep still," said I, "we could take you down with us in 10 seconds." Replied Peterkin. "Suppose a salamander was to propose to you only to keep still, and he would carry you through a blazing fire in a few seconds, what would you say?" We both laughed and shook our heads, for it was evident that nothing was to be made of Peterkin in the water. But we could not rest satisfied till we had seen more of this cave. So, after further consultation, Jack and I determined to try if we could take down a torch with us, and set fire to it in the cavern. This we found to be an undertaking of no small difficulty, but we accomplished it at last by the following means. First, we made a torch of a very inflammable nature out of the bark of a certain tree, which we cut into strips, and, after twisting, cemented together with a kind of resin or gum, which we also obtained from another tree, neither of which trees, however, was known by name to Jack. This, when prepared, we wrapped up in a great number of plies of cocoa-nut cloth, so that we were confident it could not get wet during the short time it should be under water. Then we took a small piece of the tinder, which we had carefully treasured up lest we should require it, as before said, when the sun should fail us. Also we rolled up some dry grass and a few chips, which, with a little bow and drill like those described before, we made into another bundle and wrapped it up in cocoa-nut cloth. When all was ready, we laid aside our garments, with the exception of our trousers, which, as we did not know what rough scraping against the rocks we might be subjected to, we kept on. Then we advanced to the edge of the rocks, Jack carrying one bundle with the torch, I the other with the things for producing fire. "Now don't weary for us, Peterkin, should we be gone for some time," said Jack. "We'll be sure to return in half an hour at the very latest, however interesting the cave should be, that we may relieve your mind." "Farewell," said Peterkin, coming up to us with a look of deep but pretended solemnity, while he shook hands and kissed each of us on the cheek. "Farewell! And while you are gone I shall repose my weary limbs under the shelter of this bush, and meditate on the changefulness of all things earthly, with special reference to the forsaken condition of a poor shipwrecked sailor boy." So saying, Peterkin waved his hand, turned from us, and cast himself upon the ground with a look of melancholy resignation, which was so well feigned that I would have thought it genuine had he not accompanied it with a gentle wink. We both laughed, and springing from the rocks all together, plunged head first into the sea. We gained the interior of the submarine cave without difficulty, and, on emerging from the waves, supported ourselves for some time by treading water, while we held the two bundles above our heads. This we did in order to let our eyes become accustomed to the obscurity. Then, when we could see sufficiently, we swam to a shelving rock and landed in safety. Having wrung the water from our trousers and dried ourselves as well as we could under the circumstances, we proceeded to ignite the torch. This we accomplished without difficulty in a few minutes, and no sooner did it flare up than we were struck dumb with the wonderful objects that were revealed to our gaze. The roof of the cavern just above us seemed to be about 10 feet high, but grew higher as it receded into the distance until it was lost in darkness. It seemed to be made of coral, and was supported by massive columns of the same material. Immense icicles, as they appeared to us, hung from it in various places. These, however, were formed not of ice, but of a species of limestone, which seemed to flow in a liquid form towards the point of each, where it became solid. A good many drops fell, however, to the rock below, and these formed little cones, which rose to meet the points above. Some of them had already met, and thus we saw how the pillars were formed, which at first seemed to us as if they had been placed there by some human architect to support the roof. As we advanced farther in, we saw that the floor was composed of the same material as the pillars, and it presented the curious appearance of ripples such as are formed on water when gently ruffled by the wind. There were several openings on either hand in the walls that seemed to lead into other caverns, but these we did not explore at this time. We also observed that the ceiling was curiously marked in many places, as if it were the fretwork of a noble cathedral, and the walls, as well as the roof, sparkled in the light of our torch, and threw back gleams and flashes as if they were covered with precious stones. Although we proceeded far into this cavern, we did not come to the end of it, and we were obliged to return more speedily than we would otherwise have done, as our torch was nearly expended. We did not observe any openings in the roof, or any indications whereby light might enter, but near the entrance to the cavern stood an immense mass of pure white coral rock, which caught and threw back the little light that found an entrance through the cave's mouth, and thus produced, we conjectured, the pale green object which had first attracted our attention. We concluded also that the reflecting power of this rock was that which gave forth the dim light that faintly illumined the first part of the cave. Before diving through the passage again, we extinguished the small piece of our torch that remained, and left it in a dry spot, conceiving that we might possibly stand in need of it if, at any future date, we should chance to wet our torch while diving into the cavern. As we stood for a few minutes after it was out, waiting till our eyes became accustomed to the gloom, we could not help remarking the deep, intense stillness and the unutterable gloom of all around us, and as I thought of the stupendous dome above, and the countless gems that had sparkled in the torchlight a few minutes before, it came into my mind to consider how strange it is that God should make such wonderful and exquisitely beautiful works never to be seen at all, except indeed by chance visitors such as ourselves. I afterwards found that there were many such caverns among the islands of the South Seas, some of them larger and more beautiful than the one I have just described. "Now, Ralph, are you ready?" said Jack in a low voice that seemed to echo up into the dome above. "Quite ready." "Come along, then," said he, and plunging off the ledge of the rock into the water, we dived through the narrow entrance. In a few seconds we were panting on the rocks above, and receiving the congratulations of our friend Peterkin. Chapter 13. Recording by Tom Weiss. Of the Coral Island. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Coral Island, by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 14. Strange Peculiarity of the Tides, also of the Twilight. Peterkin's remarkable conduct in embracing a little pig and killing a big sow. Sage remarks on jesting, also on love. It was quite a relief to us to breathe the pure air and to enjoy the glad sunshine after our long ramble in the Diamond Cave, as we named it. For although we did not stay more than half an hour away, it seemed to us much longer. While we were dressing and during our walk home, we did our best to satisfy the curiosity of poor Peterkin, who seemed to regret, with lively sincerity, his inability to dive. There was no help for it, however, so we condoled with him as we best could. Had there been any great rise or fall in the tide of these seas, we might perhaps have found it possible to take him down with us at low water, but as the tide never rose or fell more than 18 inches or 2 feet, this was impossible. This peculiarity of the tide, its slight rise and fall, had not attracted our observation till some time after our residence on the island. Neither had we observed another curious circumstance until we had been some time there. This was the fact that the tide rose and fell with constant regularity, instead of being affected by the changes of the moon as in our own country, and as it is in most other parts of the world, at least in all parts with which I am acquainted. Every day and every night, at 12 o'clock precisely, the tide is at full, and at 6 o'clock every morning and every evening it is ebb. I can speak with much confidence on this singular circumstance, as we took particular note of it and never found it to alter. Of course, I must admit, we had to guess the hour of 12 midnight, and I think we could do this pretty correctly, but in regard to 12 noon we are quite positive, because we easily found the highest point that the sun reached in the sky by placing ourselves at a certain spot, whence we observed the sharp summit of a cliff resting against the sky, just where the sun passed. Jack and I were surprised that we had not noticed this the first few days of our residence here, and could only account for it by our being so much taken up with the more obvious wonders of our novel situation. I have since learned, however, that this want of observation is a sad and very common infirmity of human nature, there being hundreds of persons before whose eyes the most wonderful things are passing every day, who nevertheless are totally ignorant of them. I therefore have to record my sympathy with such persons, and to recommend to them a course of conduct which I have now for a long time myself adopted, namely, the habit of forcing my attention upon all things that go on around me, and of taking some degree of interest in them, whether I feel it naturally or not. I suggest this the more earnestly, though humbly, because I have very frequently come to know that my indifference to a thing has generally been caused by my ignorance in regard to it. We had much serious conversation on this subject of the tides, and Jack told us, in his own quiet, philosophical way, that these tides did great good to the world in many ways, particularly in the way of cleansing the shores of the land, and carrying off the filth that was constantly poured into the sea therefrom, which, Peterkin suggested, was remarkably tidy of it to do. Poor Peterkin could never let slip an opportunity to joke, however inopportune it might be, which at first we found rather a disagreeable propensity, as it often interrupted the flow of very agreeable conversation. And indeed, I cannot too strongly record my disapprobation of this tendency in general, but we became so used to it at last that we found it no interruption whatever. Indeed, strange to say, we came to feel that it was a necessary part of our enjoyment, such is the force of habit, and found that the sudden outbursts of mirth resulting from his humorous disposition quite natural and refreshing to us in the midst of our more serious conversations. But I must not misrepresent Peterkin. We often found, to our surprise, that he knew many things which we did not, and I also observed that those things which he learned from experience were never forgotten. From all these things I came at length to understand that things very opposite and dissimilar in themselves, when united, do make an agreeable whole, as, for example, we three on this our island, although most unlike in many things, when united, made a trio so harmonious that I question if there ever met before such an agreeable triumvirate. There was, indeed, no note of discord whatever in the symphony we played together on that sweet coral island, and I am now persuaded that this was owing to our having been all tuned to the same key, namely, that of love. Yes, we loved one another with much fervency while we lived on that island, and for the matter of that, we love each other still. And while I am on this subject, or rather the subject that just preceded it, namely the tides, I may here remark on another curious natural phenomenon. We found that there was little or no twilight in this island. We had a distinct remembrance of the charming long twilight at home, which some people think the most delightful part of the day, though for my part I have always preferred sunrise, and when we first landed we used to sit down on some rocky point or eminence at the close of our day's work to enjoy the evening breeze, but no sooner had the sun sunk below the horizon than all became suddenly dark. This rendered it necessary that we should watch the sun when we happened to be out hunting, for to be suddenly left in the dark while in the woods was very perplexing, as although the stars shone with great beauty and brilliancy, they could not pierce through the thick umbrageous boughs that interlaced above our heads. But to return. After having told all we could to Peterkin about the diamond cave under Spouting Cliff, as we named the locality, we were wending our way rapidly homewards when a grunt and a squeal were borne down by the land breeze to our ears. "That's the ticket!" was Peterkin's remarkable exclamation as he started convulsively and levelled his spear. "Hist!" cried Jack. "These are your friends, Peterkin. They must come over expressly to pay you a friendly visit, for it is the first time we have seen them on this side of the island." "Come along!" cried Peterkin, hurrying towards the wood, while Jack and I followed, smiling at his impatience. Another grunt and half a dozen squeals, much louder than before, came down the valley. At this time we were just opposite the small vale which lay between the valley of the wreck and Spouting Cliff. "I say, Peterkin!" cried Jack in a hoarse whisper. "Well, what is it?" "Stay a bit, man. These grunters are just up there on the hillside. If you go and stand with Ralph in the lee of yon cliff, I'll cut round behind and drive them through the gorge, so that you'll have a better chance of picking out a good one. Now, mind you pitch into a fat young pig, Peterkin," added Jack as he sprang into the bushes. "Won't I just!" said Peterkin, licking his lips, as we took our station beside the cliff. "I feel quite a tender affection for young pigs in my heart. Perhaps it would be more correct to say in my tum." "There they come!" cried I, as a terrific yell from Jack sent the whole herd screaming down the hill. Now Peterkin, being unable to hold back, crept a short way up a very steep grassy mound, in order to get a better view of the hogs before they came up, and just as he raised his head above the summit, two little pigs, which had outrun their companions, rushed over the top with the utmost precipitation. One of these brushed close past Peterkin's ear; the other, unable to arrest its headlong flight, went, as Peterkin himself afterwards expressed it, bash into his arms with a sudden squeal, which was caused more by the force of the blow than the will of the animal, and both of them rolled violently down to the foot of the mound. No sooner was this reached than the little pig recovered its feet, tossed up its tail, and fled shrieking from the spot. But I slung a large stone after it, which, being fortunately well aimed, hit it behind the ear and felled it to the earth. "Capital, Ralph! That's your sort!" cried Peterkin, who, to my surprise and great relief, had risen to his feet apparently unhurt, though much dishevelled. He rushed frantically towards the gorge, which the yells of the hogs told us they were now approaching. I had made up my mind that I would abstain from killing another, as, if Peterkin should be successful, 2 were more than sufficient for our wants at the present time. Suddenly they all burst forth, 2 or 3 little round ones in advance, and an enormous old sow with a drove of hogs at her heels. "Now, Peterkin," said I, "there's a nice little fat one. Just spear it." But Peterkin did not move. He allowed it to pass unharmed. I looked at him in surprise, and saw that his lips were compressed and his eyebrows knitted, as if he were about to fight with some awful enemy. "What is it?" I inquired with some trepidation. Suddenly he levelled his spear, darted forward, and with a yell that nearly froze the blood in my veins, stabbed the old sow to the heart. Nay, so vigorously was it done that the spear went in at one side and came out at the other. "Oh, Peterkin," said I, going up to him, "what have you done?" "Done? I've killed their great-great-grandmother, that's all," said he, looking with a somewhat awestruck expression at the transfixed animal. "Hallo! What's this?" said Jack as he came up. "Why, Peterkin, you must be fond of a tough chop. If you mean to eat this old hog, she'll try your jaws, I warrant. What possessed you to stick her, Peterkin?" "Why, the fact is, I want a pair of shoes." "What have your shoes to do with this old hog?" said I, smiling. "My present shoes have certainly nothing to do with her," replied Peterkin. "Nevertheless, she will have a good deal to do with my future shoes. The fact is, when I saw you floor that pig so neatly, Ralph, it struck me that there was little use in killing another. Then I remembered all at once that I had long wanted some leather or tough substance to make shoes of. And this old grandmother seems so tough that I just made up my mind to stick her, and you see I've done it." "That you certainly have, Peterkin," said Jack as he was examining the transfixed animal. We now considered how we were to carry our game home, for although the distance was short, the hog was very heavy. At length we hit on the plan of tying its 4 feet together and passing the spear handle between them. Jack took one end on his shoulder, I took the other on mine, and Peterkin carried the small pig. Thus we returned in triumph to our bower, laden, as Peterkin remarked, with the glorious spoils of a noble hunt. As he afterwards spoke in similarly glowing terms in reference to the supper that followed, there is every reason to believe that we retired that night to our leafy beds in a high state of satisfaction. Chapter 14. Recording by Tom Weiss. Of the Coral Island. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Coral Island by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 15. Boat Building Extraordinary. Peterkin tries his hand at cookery and fails most signally. The boat finished. Curious conversation with the cat, and other matters. For many days after this, Jack applied himself with unremitting assiduity to the construction of our boat, which at length began to look something like one. But those only who have had the thing to do can entertain a right idea of the difficulty involved in such an undertaking, with no other implements than an axe, a bit of hoop iron, a sail needle, and a broken penknife. But Jack did it. He was of that disposition which will not be conquered. When he believed himself to be acting rightfully, he overcame all obstacles. I have seen Jack, when doubtful whether what he was about to do were right or wrong, as timid and vacillating as a little girl, and I honour him for it. As this boat was a curiosity in its way, a few words here relative to the manner of its construction may not be amiss. I have already mentioned the chestnut tree with its wonderful buttresses or planks. This tree, then, furnished us with the chief part of our material. First of all, Jack sought out a limb of a tree of such form and size as, while it should form the keel, a bend at either end should form the stem and stern posts. Such a piece, however, was not easy to obtain, but at last he procured it by rooting up a small tree which had a branch growing at the proper angle about 10 feet up its stem, with 2 strong roots growing in such form as enabled him to make a flat-sterned boat. This placed, he procured 3 branching roots of suitable size, which he fitted to the keel at equal distances, thus forming 3 strong ribs. Now the squaring and shaping of these, and the cutting of the grooves in the keel, was an easy enough matter, as it was all work for the axe, in the use of which Jack was become wonderfully expert; but it was quite a different affair when he came to nailing the ribs to the keel, for we had no instrument capable of boring a large hole, and no nails to fasten them with. We were, indeed, much perplexed here, but Jack at length devised an instrument that served very well. He took the remainder of our hoop iron and beat it into the form of a pipe or cylinder, about as thick as a man's finger. This he did by means of our axe and the old rusty axe we had found at the house of the poor man at the other side of the island. This, when made red hot, bored slowly through the timbers, and the better to retain the heat, Jack shut up one end of it and filled it with sand. True, the work was very slowly done, but it mattered not. We had little else to do. 2 holes were bored in each timber, about 1.5 inches apart, and also down into the keel, but not quite through. Into these were placed stout pegs made of a tree called ironwood, and when they were hammered well home, the timbers were as firmly fixed as if they had been nailed with iron. The gunwales, which were very stout, were fixed in a similar manner. But besides the wooden nails, they were firmly lashed to the stem and stern posts and ribs by means of a species of cordage which we had contrived to make out of the fibrous husk of the cocoa-nut. This husk was very tough, and when a number of the threads were joined together, they formed excellent cordage. At first we tied the different lengths together, but this was such a clumsy and awkward complication of knots that we contrived, by careful interlacing of the ends together before twisting, to make good cordage of any size or length we chose. Of course, it cost us much time and infinite labor, but Jack kept up our spirits when we grew weary, and so all that we required was at last constructed. Planks were now cut off the chestnut trees of about 1 inch thick. These were dressed with the axe, but clumsily, for an axe is ill adapted for such work. 5 of these planks on each side were sufficient, and we formed the boat in a very rounded, barrel-like shape, in order to have as little twisting of the planks as possible, for although we could easily bend them, we could not easily twist them. Having no nails to rivet the planks with, we threw aside the ordinary fashion of boat building and adopted one of our own. The planks were therefore placed on each other's edges, and sewed together with the tough cordage already mentioned. They were also thus sewed to the stem, the stern, and the keel. Each stitch or tie was 6 inches apart, and was formed thus: 3 holes were bored in the upper plank, and 3 in the lower, the holes being above each other, that is, in a vertical line. Through these holes the cord was passed, and when tied, formed a powerful stitch of 3-ply. Besides this, we placed between the edges of the planks layers of cocoa-nut fibre, which, as it swelled when wetted, would, we hoped, make our little vessel watertight. But in order further to secure this end, we collected a large quantity of pitch from the breadfruit tree, with which, when boiled in our old iron pot, we paid the whole of the inside of the boat, and while it was yet hot, placed large pieces of cocoa-nut cloth on it, and then gave it another coat above that. Thus the interior was covered with a tough, watertight material, while the exterior, being uncovered, and so exposed to the swelling action of the water was, we hoped, likely to keep the boat quite dry. I may add that our hopes were not disappointed. While Jack was thus engaged, Peterkin and I sometimes assisted him; but as our assistance was not much required, we more frequently went a-hunting on the extensive mud flats at the entrance of the long valley which lay nearest to our bower. Here we found large flocks of ducks of various kinds, some of them bearing so much resemblance to the wild ducks of our own country that I think they must have been the same. On these occasions we took the bow and the sling, with both of which we were often successful, though I must confess that I was the least so. Our suppers were thus pleasantly varied, and sometimes we had such a profusion spread out before us that we frequently knew not with which of the dainties to begin. I must also add that the poor old cat which we had brought home had always a liberal share of our good things, and so well was it looked after, especially by Peterkin, that it recovered much of its former strength, and seemed to improve in sight as well as hearing. The large flat stone, or rock of coral, which stood just in front of the entrance to our bower, was our table. On this rock we had spread out the few articles we possessed the day we were shipwrecked, and on the same rock, during many a day afterwards, we spread out the bountiful supply with which we had been blessed on our coral island. Sometimes we sat down at this table to a feast, consisting of hot rolls, as Peterkin called the newly baked breadfruit, a roast pig, roast duck, boiled and roasted yams, coconuts, taro, and sweet potatoes, which we followed up with a dessert of plums, apples, and plantains, the last being a large-sized and delightful fruit, which grew on a large shrub or tree not more than 12 feet high, with light green leaves of enormous length and breadth. These luxurious feasts were usually washed down with coconut nut lemonade. Occasionally Peterkin tried to devise some new dish, a conglomerate, as he used to say, but these generally turned out such atrocious compounds that he was ultimately induced to give up his attempts in extreme disgust, not forgetting, however, to point out to Jack that his failure was a direct contradiction to the proverb which he, Jack, was constantly thrusting down his throat, namely that "where there's a will there's a way," for he had a great will to become a cook, but could by no means find a way to accomplish that end. One day, while Peterkin and I were seated beside our table, on which dinner was spread, Jack came up from the beach, and flinging down his axes, exclaimed, "There, lads, the boat's finished at last, so we've nothing to do now but shape 2 pair of oars, and then we may put to sea as soon as we like." This piece of news threw us into a state of great joy, for although we were aware that the boat had been gradually getting near its completion, it had taken so long that we did not expect it to be quite ready for at least 2 or 3 weeks. But Jack had wrought hard and said nothing, in order to surprise us. "My dear fellow," cried Peterkin, "you're a perfect trump! But why did you not tell us it was so nearly ready? Won't we have a jolly sail to-morrow, eh?" "Don't talk so much, Peterkin," said Jack, "and pray hand me a bit of that pig." "Certainly, my dear," cried Peterkin, seizing the axe. "Which part will you have? A leg, or a wing, or a piece of the breast? Which?" "A hind leg, if you please," answered Jack; "and pray be so good as to include the tail." "With all my heart," said Peterkin, exchanging the axe for his hoop iron knife, with which he cut off the desired portion. "I'm only too glad, my dear boy, to see that your appetite is so wholesale, and there's no chance whatever of its dwindling down into retail again, at least in so far as this pig is concerned. Ralph, lad, why don't you laugh, eh?" he added, turning suddenly to me with a severe look of inquiry. "Laugh?" said I. "What at, Peterkin? Why should I laugh?" Both Jack and Peterkin answered this inquiry by themselves laughing so immoderately that I was induced to believe I had missed noticing some good joke, so I begged that it might be explained to me, but as this only produced repeated roars of laughter, I smiled and helped myself to another slice of plantain. "Well, but," continued Peterkin, "I was talking of a sail tomorrow. Can't we have one, Jack?" "No," replied Jack, "we can't have a sail; but I hope we shall have a row, as I intend to work hard at the oars this afternoon, and if we can't get them finished by sunset, we'll light our candle nuts and turn them out of hands before we turn into bed." "Very good," said Peterkin, tossing a lump of pork to the cat, who received it with a mew of satisfaction. "I'll help you if I can." "Afterwards," continued Jack, "we will make a sail out of the cocoa nut cloth, and rig up a mast, and then we shall be able to sail to some of the other islands, and visit our old friends the penguins." The prospect of being so soon in a position to extend our observations to the other islands, and enjoy a sail over the beautiful sea, afforded us much delight, and after dinner we set about making the oars in good earnest. Jack went into the woods and blocked them roughly out with the axe, and I smoothed them down with a knife, while Peterkin remained in the bower spinning, or rather twisting, some strong, thick cordage with which to fasten them to the boat. We worked hard and rapidly, so that when the sun went down, Jack and I returned to the bower with 4 stout oars, which required little to be done to them save a slight degree of polishing with the knife. As we drew near we were suddenly arrested by the sound of a voice. We were not a little surprised at this. Indeed, I may almost say alarmed, for although Peterkin was undoubtedly fond of talking, we had never up to this time found him talking to himself. We listened intently, and still heard the sound of a voice, as if in conversation. Jack motioned me to be silent, and advancing to the bower on tiptoe, we peeped in. The sight that met our gaze was certainly not a little amusing. On the top of a log, which we sometimes used as a table, sat the black cat, with a very demure expression on its countenance, and in front of it, sitting on the ground with his legs extended on either side of the log, was Peterkin. At the moment we saw him, he was gazing intently into the cat's face, with his nose about 4 inches from it, his hands being thrust into his breeches pockets. "Cat," said Peterkin, turning his head a little on one side, "I love you." There was a pause, as if Peterkin awaited a reply to this affectionate declaration, but the cat said nothing. "Do you hear me?" cried Peterkin sharply. "I love you, I do. Don't you love me?" To this touching appeal the cat said "Mew" faintly. "Ah, that's right. You're a jolly old rascal. Why did you not speak up at once, eh?" And Peterkin put forward his mouth and kissed the cat on the nose. "Yes," continued Peterkin after a pause, "I love you. Do you think I'd say so if I didn't, you black villain? I love you because I've got to take care of you, and to look after you, and to think about you, and to see that you don't die." "Mew, meow," said the cat. "Very good," continued Peterkin. "Quite true, I have no doubt. But you've no right to interrupt me, sir. Hold your tongue till I have done speaking. Moreover, cat, I love you because you came to me the first time you ever saw me, and didn't seem to be afraid, and appeared to be fond of me, though you didn't know that I wasn't going to kill you. Now that was brave, that was bold, and very jolly, old boy, and I love you for it, I do." Again there was a pause of a few minutes, during which the cat looked placid, and Peterkin dropped his eyes upon its toes, as if in contemplation. Suddenly he looked up. "Well, cat, what are you thinking now? Won't speak, eh? Now tell me, don't you think it's a monstrous shame that those 2 scoundrels, Jack and Ralph, should keep us waiting for our supper so long?" Here the cat arose, put up its back and stretched itself, yawned slightly, and licked the point of Peterkin's nose. "Just so, old boy, you're a clever fellow. I really do believe the brute understands me," said Peterkin, while a broad grin overspread his face as he drew back and surveyed the cat. At this point Jack burst into a loud fit of laughter. The cat uttered an angry "fuff" and fled, while Peterkin sprang up and exclaimed: "Bad luck to you, Jack! You've nearly made the heart jump out of my body, you have!" "Perhaps I have," replied Jack, laughing as we entered the bower; "but as I don't intend to keep you or the cat any longer from your supper, I hope that you'll both forgive me." Peterkin endeavoured to turn this affair off with a laugh, but I observed that he blushed very deeply at the time we discovered ourselves, and he did not seem to relish any allusion to the subject afterwards, so we refrained from remarking on it ever after, though it tickled us not a little at the time. After supper we retired to rest, and to dream of wonderful adventures in our little boat, and distant voyages upon the sea. Chapter 15. Recording by Tom Weiss.